Star Wars: The Bad Batch recently gave us a glimpse of how, in canon, the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps transitioned from being primarily composed of clones to being made up of organic recruits. It also revealed that the first of these recruits, the so-called TK Troopers, were trained by clone Commandos, which might have been a surprising revelation for some. After all, these TK Troopers were just prototypical Stormtroopers. That's a hell of a downgrade, isn't it? How were Stormtroopers so terrible if they were trained by Commandos? Today, we'll be exploring that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
It seems unbelievable that Stormtroopers were trained by Commandos. After all, Stormtroopers sucked, right? Well, no. Stormtroopers weren't nearly as ineffective as they're often made out to be, though they certainly sucked in the sense that they supported the Empire. Stormtroopers come across as terrible soldiers from our perspective because we pretty much only see them when they lose or when they're ordered to lose. However, as a whole, Stormtroopers were incredibly effective. Hell, they were pretty much the only part of the Imperial structure that did what they were supposed to do, despite being burdened by useless officers, miles of red tape, and petty infighting among the higher-ups. You can even see examples of effective Stormtroopers in the original trilogy. Consider the attack on Tantive 4 or the Battle of Hoth, in which Stormtroopers, who were at a tactical disadvantage, absolutely wiped the floor with numerically superior rebel forces. The Stormtrooper Corps was composed of elite shock troops, the best the Empire had to offer, with a rigid ideology, undying loyalty to the Emperor, and some of the best training and equipment in the galaxy. Stormtroopers weren't lacking for skill, but rather for competent leaders. When they failed, it was almost always because the officers up top had misstepped. Their terrible accuracy aboard the first Death Star was deliberate, for example. As Princess Leia pointed out after the Millennium Falcon made its escape, those Stormtroopers had been ordered to let the rebels get away. Their poor performance in the Battle of Endor was also the result of incompetent superiors who failed to take the Ewoks seriously and screwed over the 501st Legion because of it. Even the best soldiers will lose battles when the odds are against them or when their superiors stuff up. It's also important to remember that the Empire wasn't looking for super soldiers. The Stormtrooper Corps was supposed to put down tougher insurrections, and it was terrifyingly good at its job. It took 17 years for resistance to become coherent enough to stand up to them after all. And again, when insurgents did start winning major victories against the Empire, it was rarely the fault of the Stormtroopers. Nonetheless, it's indisputable that Stormtroopers were less effective than clone troopers, and that they certainly failed to live up to the standards of clone Commandos. So, what gives? The clone troopers of the Grand Army of the Republic existed exclusively for war. From the moment they could think, they were taught what they needed to know to be a soldier, and pretty much only what they needed to know to be a soldier. War was supposed to be all they knew, and all they were meant for. Most of their waking lives were spent training, to the point where combat became a sort of intuitive habit for them, something deeply ingrained into who the clones are. That was what made them such capable soldiers. Needless to say, that's not something that's easy to replicate in recruits, if it was even possible. Recruited Stormtroopers were, in the vast majority of cases, not bred and raised specifically for the purpose of being soldiers, which meant that combat would never be as instinctive for them as it was for the clones. This difference wasn't really something the Empire cared about, however. As we said earlier, they neither needed nor wanted to pay for super soldiers. Additionally, a large part of the reason that the clones were so effective was because their droid enemies were highly predictable, which allowed them to quickly acclimate to the sort of war they would fight. After acclimating to the war, they developed experience, which made them into more effective soldiers. But Stormtroopers didn't have that opportunity. They fought isolated campaigns against wildly diverse groups of insurgents who rarely fought the same way, thought the same way, or even had the same goals. These insurgencies were also fairly rare, meaning that most Stormtroopers didn't really have the opportunity to get any real experience, even when the Galactic Civil War broke out. It only really fell into a pattern the Stormtroopers could predict after the Battle of Endor, once the Rebellion became a new republic. By that point, it was too late. Our opening question made what might seem like a natural assumption, that clone Commandos were extremely good soldiers. But that wasn't really the case. Clone Commandos were meant for special operations, not frontline combat, while the exact opposite was the case for Stormtroopers. In Legends, it was well documented that clone commandos performed poorly on the front lines. Consider the first Battle of Geonosis, in which half of all clone commandos died because the Jedi didn't understand this distinction. Clone commandos weren't soldiers in the sense that regular clone troopers and their stormtrooper successors were. This was the case in canon as well as Legends, though we don't have any examples as good as Geonosis to illustrate this. Evidently, the Imperial officers responsible for the TK Trooper program were dumb enough to make the same mistake the Jedi had in Legends. Now, we don't think the Commandos just totally botched the training the TK Troopers had or anything like that. We know that Stormtroopers were ultimately pretty effective, so the Commandos must have done something right after all. But the idea that the Stormtroopers should have been the best soldiers in the galaxy if they were trained by clone commandos is inherently flawed, since clone commandos were notable for performing poorly and getting themselves killed when acting in frontline roles. While Stormtroopers certainly didn't do their jobs perfectly, they did them better than clone commandos likely would have in their position. This isn't to say that Stormtroopers were better than clone commandos, but rather that the two weren't really comparable. Their jobs were different, both of them just involved a lot of shooting. When it comes to the efficacy of Stormtroopers, it's also important to consider skill atrophy and the state of the Empire in general. As we mentioned earlier, Stormtroopers didn't see a lot of action even once the Galactic Civil War took off, and because of that, their skills started to fade. While Stormtroopers that weren't on leave were supposed to train regularly, many Imperial officers became lax about enforcing that rule during the Dark Times, meaning the Stormtroopers started to slip even before the Rebel Alliance came along. By the time there was a war to fight, much of the Imperial military wasn't prepared for it anymore. Furthermore, it's always important to keep in mind what soldiers were fighting for. Stormtrooper recruits signed up to join the Corps for a variety of reasons, but by the time they had actually put on their helmets, their trainers had made sure that they were all fighting for the Emperor and only the Emperor. The sheer loyalty Stormtroopers had for the Emperor was almost terrifying, but at the end of the day, they fought and died for the whims of a single man that most Stormtroopers had never even met. That wasn't all that strong of a motivation, especially when you compare Stormtroopers to their rebel counterparts who were fighting for the freedom of their homeworlds and families. This, for the record, played a major role in why many Stormtroopers started to genuinely suck after the Battle of Endor. With Palpatine dead, they were bereft of purpose and motivation. It didn't help matters that Stormtroopers were routinely asked to carry out horrible orders on penalty of death, especially as the Galactic Civil War ramped up. No matter how indoctrinated you are, the sorts of war crimes that Stormtroopers were responsible for would seriously screw with anyone. That sort of baggage also leads soldiers to become less effective, a shortcoming that was particularly pronounced in the Stormtroopers who were up against a morally superior enemy. There's a reason the Imperial military started to hemorrhage recruits to the rebels after Alderaan, after all. So that's our look at why Stormtroopers were inferior to clones despite being trained by clone commandos. But what do you think? What do you think of the new TK Trooper armor? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.